Welcome to Open the Aperture, a video series brought to you by Imgix. In this video series, we look to shine more light on important topics about digital assets on the web. We will explore best practices for your images, animations, CDN, and video in an ever-evolving technological landscape. Let's get started. Hi, my name is Tom Dale, Head of Customer Success here at Imgix. Today, we're going to go over how to lazy load images for optimal page speed. This is part 3 of a 4-part episode on optimizing images for page speed. Welcome back, Ty and Andrew. They're from Cantilever, a web design and development consultancy. Thank you so much for joining me again today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Always fun to be here, Tom.
So we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes this idea that it's important your site loads fast, right? And it's usable in a quick period of time, which, core of vitals is supposed to be this focus, right? Like that your site is actually usable and fast. So a great way to ensure your site loads fast is to minimize the amount of time that you load when you first come to a site. When you first load a website, everything that you can visually see in the browser, it's considered above the fold or in the viewport, or I don't know what you prefer saying, right? But all of the images below the fold don't need to be loaded yet. So if you delay loading those images right away, you can actually help the speed of your initial load time, and that really improves your interactivity, right? So today's episode is all about the images that you don't see. So Ty, do you find yourself talking to clients a lot about deferring off-screen images?
Well, so our clients usually don't think about any of how this stuff works, but they know that when they go to their site after we have built it and optimized the way that the images load, that it loads very, very, very fast. And like you said, if no one's going to be looking at that image, there's absolutely no reason to load it in. So for us, lazy loading is a vital technique. It's not an optional thing that you can add on a project by project basis. It's something that you really need to have if you're serving any substantial amount of images, because statistics will show if you put analytics on your site and you track the scroll position that users take while they're navigating through your site, you will see that the vast majority of people never get to that 75th percentile or even the 50th percentile of a long scrolling web page, which means that if you're serving an image in your footer, for instance, and 95% of your website visitors aren't getting there, you are wasting 95% of that bandwidth, and you are delaying all of the other things that could be loading on your website while the browser is waiting for that image.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea that the audit in page speed performance is called defer off-screen images, but you said lazy loading, right? Like that's the more common term I think everyone might really use, and I guess the right method to defer the off-screen images is
I suppose that they might be avoiding like a Kleenex problem where they wanted it to have a generic term because there might be other ways that this is known. But even the new Chrome API, which Andrew's going to discuss, uses that term lazy. I don't know, maybe it's pejorative or something, and we shouldn't be calling our images lazy, but however you want to call it, it's a vital technique and something that is actually not that difficult to implement either. You just have to kind of know your way around the different tools available, and there are plenty of good tools out there.
Yeah. So talking about those tools, maybe one of the more popular ones, correctly called, is Lazysizes.js, right? And then also Chrome, they recently released a new functionality to their browsers to where you can actually just enter loading equals lazy in the image tag, and then it'll also do lazy loading, but in Chrome only, right? And another one is using the intersection observer API. This is an API that tells the browser when a section of code would enter the viewport and fire off a function to maybe load the images, right?
Right.
I think that kind of API is, if you think about it a different way, it's those infinite scrolling sites, right? How do you know when you get to the bottom and just to load in all the other things, right? That's kind of what the intersection observer API can do for images as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, Andrew, I believe the more common method you use at Cantilever is Lazysizes.js, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The loading equals lazy API doesn't have the browser footprint that you would need to be able to reliably serve this kind of stuff. for production websites yet. We love, kind of the idea. And as Ty has mentioned in previous episodes, Cantilever's general philosophy for this is we leverage the libraries and polyfills that are available until the browser support gets to the point where you can rely on it. And we're just not there yet. So in a general sense, we tend to pick Lazysizes every time.
Yeah, I think you have a technical example too. You wanted to maybe show a couple of them compared side by side and how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. And you can see that I just pulled up kind of the browser imprint of the loading, kind of the native loading implementation. And you can see that we just don't have the footprint that we want yet. But I do have an example here of Lazysizes kind of in place. Let me just switch over to the code view. And I think you'll get a pretty neat kind of view as to what's going on. So what I've done here is I have an example of two kind of different views of how we can look at it. The first one, I did actually leverage the loading equals lazy implementation. I can show you how that's done. But then afterwards, I did a Lazysizes implementation that's a little bit more standard. So if we look at the network tab, I'm going to reload one more time and kind of shock everyone's eyes. But if we take a basic look at what's happening here, the first thing that we have on the page is a kind of a simple image tag. So I'll scroll down a little bit just to show you what that looks like. And we've got kind of your standard image implementation that just kind of comes in. This gets loaded automatically whenever the page comes into play, and it has to finish before the page is fully loaded. A little bit further down, we have the first implementation of a lazy loaded image, which is going to come in here. And this is the native lazy load implementation. Now, I've purposefully not played with the idea of kind of when the image shows up. You can set thresholds for lazy loading that allow it to ensure that the image shows up before the user actually gets to it. But in this instance, I wanted to show the pop-in of the image as we actually get to the place where we would actually see that image in the viewport. And you can see in the network panel here that the image has actually popped in. Now, there are multiple images on this page, but at this point, we've only shown two. The kind of the analogy that I like to make is it's kind of like a waiter showing up with your food at a restaurant. If you had to wait for the appetizer and the main course and the dessert to all be finished and then would all show up at the same time when you're trying to eat, it's not very helpful. What you want is kind of just-in-time loading. The images come in as you get to need them, and then you're never loading more than you want. You're never kind of forcing additional bandwidth on your users. So if we scroll down a little bit, I can take a quick look at the native lazy load, which I mentioned before. So this is a simple implementation that just references loading equals lazy. It does work. We've seen that it loads the image appropriately, but it'll work on Chrome, but it won't work on other browsers. So it's not something that we can rely on the way that we want to. Here, what I've done is I've pulled in kind of a couple of different bonuses here. The first one is I'm implementing the lazy load class, which is actually the Lazysizes implementation of this. And I've actually moved it into an Imgix kind of implementation because there are so many benefits that come with that kind of in a general sense. So as we scroll down again, you can see that the next image pops in as we scroll down, and this has kind of the lazy loaded implementation built in, and you only get what you actually need as you scroll down the page.
What's really amazing about this kind of implementation is that the lazy loading technology or methodology is a separate kind of axis of optimization from using Imgix. And you can use these techniques without Imgix. But when the two are combined, then you get these really powerful possibilities, because the way that particularly Imgix.js has a load order and a processing methodology for your images to get the perfect size, it fits in great with a lazy loading methodology, because at the time that that image lazy loads, the browser is going to know exactly how big it is. It's going to be able to serve a really perfect size for that image. And it's the combination of these two things that lets us find that perfect balance between kind of engineering and optimization, where any given developer doesn't have to do a lot of work to make an image fully optimized. And Imgix and Lazysizes kind of work together to ensure that the user gets exactly the pixels they need at the right time.
I really love that that thought of the dining experience. I've never heard that analogy used for the lazy loading, because it kind of like stirs up that weird irritation that you had in previous experiences in life, and you go, I don't want that to happen with my website, my images.
Well, I mean, it comes back to the idea that Cantilever has of digital hospitality, where we're trying to make things inviting and welcoming for all users. And this is one of those things that we can do on a daily basis that makes it feel better. We've all had the waiter or waitress who comes along and just knows the timing and knows what you want and when they should be around when you need it. And Imgix and lazy loading allows you to kind of have that experience for your website users. Nothing that they don't want, everything they need.
And tying it back to the core web vitals, we talked about the first input delay metric. And what that means is that when the user is ready to interact with a website and they try to interact with it, how long does it take before the website can respond? And one of the things that can really hurt you there is if you have a sort of long, staggered load of all sorts of different resources that might be involved in the interaction that the user is trying to perform. So if they want to click on your slideshow and change the slide, but the JavaScript hasn't loaded yet because you're loading images that are 2,000 pixels below the fold, that's a big waste. And that's a moment of discomfort that is very easily avoidable. So the lazy loading methodology and other kind of related JavaScript methodologies of, like Andrew said, the just-in-time philosophy allows you to only push over the wire what the user is going to imminently need and ensure that you're using their bandwidth well, which is not only good for business, but is also just conscientious and good hospitality.
So I want to have a look at an example maybe of a real website too, and just kind of show how the page speed score would look and how you kind of dig through the network tab and kind of ensure you're not deferring off-screen images, I guess, right? So I'm going to go ahead and enter the URL and let it analyze here. And this is the site we're going to be looking at. So you can see there's going to be a lot of shoes down here, right? So let's see, as this runs, one way to kind of quickly notice if your site is or is not working for that, I'm going to pull up the network tab and switch to mobile and just give it a hard refresh here. And you can already see down here, like when you click on these different items, it's showing 191 requests, right? When I click on image, it's now dividing it. It said, hey, there are 203 total requests, but 100 of them are image. So I haven't looked anywhere. I've only looked at this. How in the world could I have loaded 100 images, right? And as I scroll down through the site, you'll see I'm not loading any new images still. Like all of these images shouldn't be loaded yet. So if I do look at the page speed score, I would expect, yep, here you go, the top opportunity, defer off-screen images. And you can see it's listing, all these basic images that we saw. So definitely no reason to have to wait for 100 images to load to start interacting with the site. When, in the top screen, you only have 2, maybe 4 images to start looking at. You don't want to stop someone from shopping and looking. You want them to start right away looking and start scrolling through. And once they've started seeing some things, they're willing to wait a little bit longer because at least they're interacting with the site and seeing something.
Yeah, and you saw in that example the loading indicator running in the tab for that site. And Tom is on great San Francisco broadband, so it went pretty quick. But you can imagine if you're on your mobile device and you're seeing that loading indicator going for 10, 15 seconds while there's lots of different images loading in that are off screen, it just gives it, even if it's not functionally stopping you from doing anything, it gives you a sense that the website is slow. And that means you lose confidence in that website to solve your needs, and you might lose confidence in that brand to solve your problem as well. So fast sites give confidence to buyers, customers, whatever the case may be, that your brand is there to help them. And this is one really easy way that you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, there are a lot of people selling shoes online, right? So you may be a dedicated follower of a brand, but it doesn't mean you don't have a list of ton in your mind that you're dedicated to. So you'll eventually just leave and start looking somewhere else, right? It won't take too long.
Yeah, especially on mobile. People abandon even more than you realize, because sometimes they abandon before you even knew they were there.
And the great part about this is the implementation details. They're easily worked in with the stuff that we talked about in the previous episode about having the right sized images come in. This is all it can easily be built into your development process so that it's not taking up a ton of time, but the payoff is huge for the user and for the client as well.
Yeah. There's one other aspect of lazy loading that I would love to touch on, which is non-vertical lazy loading. So frequently on a website, you might have a banner in the hero area of the website that's a slideshow. So you can go back and forth and you can see different products or whatever the case may be. And if you don't code those properly, you're going to end up loading all of those images in that slideshow, which are going to be very heavy images because they're very big, even though the fifth slide might only end up getting shown to 1% of people or 2% of people. So lazy loading is also vital in those situations where you have, hidden images or off-screen images or things scrolling from left to right. And Lazysizes has a very good methodology for tracking that, and it does look at both axes and Intersection Observer can help with that too. And there's lots of really great software tools to help solve that problem. But it's key to not forget as you're focused on scrolling down the page that there might be images that come into the viewport due to interaction, and you want to make sure that interaction occurs before that image loads.
I mean, I think right away, real estate websites pop into my head. Like they're the ones that are notorious for that, right? They have this box here and you're always scrolling to the right to look at more images. And, there could be 30 images in there at a house, but again, you may not look at more than 3, right?
Yeah. And when you start talking about big images like that, that's where you get into really potentially substantial bandwidth costs. I mean, if you're thinking of a website like, the big, real estate platforms, they're doing hundreds of millions of uniques a month. They're pushing tons and tons of page views. And those kind of things can really add up both for users and for brands themselves.
So I know we brought up the idea of first input delay and how that affects core of vitals and defer off-screen images. I also want to talk about one of the other core of vitals that affects it. It's cumulative layout shift, and it kind of affects it in a different way. I mean, so the idea of CLS is that when you begin interacting with the website, the content of the website, should or shouldn't shift, right? Like you've had this experience, you're on a train, you're reading the article, and then it bumps up where you're not reading because something loaded in, right? And so Google is now measuring this idea of how much the site shifts and that's how it creates the score if you have a good or bad score, right? Well, thinking about the idea of lazy loading, you really do need to make sure you're lazy loading correctly. Otherwise, you could create a worse shift, right? Like it's great that the image didn't load in right away, but you do want to make sure something is in place of the image before it loads. Otherwise, the whole article is just going to be shifting like crazy. And a great way to do that is to do low quality image placeholders. And what a low quality image placeholder is just, you can think of like a blurred image or a block of color or anything, something there to just visually let the user know that something may be there and it's going to come in, and they can just keep going, right? That way it doesn't cause the shift. It creates a good user experience. They know something might be there. There's some interesting newer technologies coming out to really improve LKIP as well. Like if I think about like frameworks like Gatsby, they have a really interesting blur up technology for their images. Blur hash is a new thing coming out as well that essentially instead of loading in 2 images, the low quality one and the regular quality, it just does like an encoded version that's passed in maybe via JSON or something, and then you load in the later image after that. So there's a couple different technologies out there, and I kind of want to just dig in a little bit more about the LKIP technique and Ty, like how do you sell that to your folks when you're talking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So cumulative layout shift is definitely a big problem. I think in addition to what you mentioned about reading an article, imagine that you're on a product page and you're about to buy something, and as you start to hit that button, the button moves from where you thought it would be. That's a really bad user experience, and that could be costing you business if that's the kind of thing that's happening on your website. So you want to make sure that as soon as that first page load happens and the user gets a sense of their bearings on the page, what's where, you don't want that to change very substantially after that initial load, which means that if you do implement a lazy loading technique for your images, you have to make sure that there is space taken in the layout for an image, even if it has not loaded yet, because you're going to be encountering or pushing your users actually into situations where they may see something instead of that image while the image is loading. And sort of the default result there is that you have a empty space, which just shows your background color. And that's what happened when Andrew was demoing the technique earlier. You just see kind of empty space and then the image pops in. But you can go much further than that, and you can provide an even better user experience by providing these low quality placeholder techniques. And like you said, the traditional techniques involve actually loading two different images. So you're loading a low quality version very, very quickly over the wire, and then you're loading the high quality version later. And that works really great, but the downside is that you double the amount of network requests that you're making when you load the page. So if you're doing that hundreds of times, might not be the best idea. But we found that this kind of technique can be really useful for maybe a key image on a page. So you don't have to do it for every single image, but for your hero image, yeah, it's worth it for a low quality version to come in very, very quickly, and then the high res version to come in later. And that's going to make a more fluid user experience where the user knows what to expect, and they have that kind of instant recognition of what the page layout is like. And there are newer techniques, like you mentioned, where that image is actually encoded in your markup, so it doesn't have to go over the wire. There's no network request, and these images are usually very, very small. So I would highly encourage anyone, especially if you're in content or e-commerce, where those images are really vital, to look into this low quality placeholder technique, because it can give your users a sense that things are loading even faster than they're expecting when they, click a link on another page, and then boom, all of a sudden you have markup, you have a shape to the website, and you're actually seeing pixels that represent kind of what that image is going to look like once it's fully loaded in. That's a really high quality user experience that's unexpectedly fast.
And it's pretty easy to implement with Imgix. I mean, there's a lot of different parameters you could do. You could blur the image. You could just honestly resize the image to like 10 pixels and use CSS to make it the whole size, and then it'll create the same effect of it being blurred, right?
Yep.
I mean, the key thing is whatever you do, you just want to make sure to still optimize that blurred image, because there's nothing worse than having the blurred image be heavy, right? Like there's no reason it should be bigger than 1 or 2 kilobytes. I mean, it should be pretty small.
Exactly. And you can use kind of a consistent placeholder across your site. So most images have the same LKIP image before it gets pulled in. And the last great thing, we've talked about Lazysizes a couple of times. Lazysizes has a great implementation of LKIP built in. You can just leverage the SRC tag, put your LKIP image in there, and then the data SRC for the real version, the larger version of the image that you want to pull in later. And the page will load in with your LKIP image. And once Lazysizes takes place, once the image moves into the actual viewport, then you get the real version that gets loaded in.
Ty and Andrew, it's been great hearing about your best practices with lazy loading images. We have one final video, which will go over how to improve your page speed scores by using next-gen image formats. If you would like to try using Imgix yourself, we offer a free forever plan, which you can sign up for today at imgix.com. If you would like the best help with web design and development consultancy, I would recommend that you go to cantilever.co. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because we'll have more great content coming out. Talk to you next time.